about that concept of all's fair in love and war? What do you think's behind that?
I've never understood it. I don't know what was in the mind of the person who wrote that. And I don't know what the context was, so what they had in mind. But people have taken that cliche to mean, okay, if we're in love and we're going to fight, it's no holds barred.
Right.
And I really can't believe that the author meant that. And yes, in love and war, we are the most vulnerable. And very often, love turns to war so quickly, and war can turn to love. People who are in prisons, they're prisoners of war and have been tortured, will tell you that they eventually came to love their torturers. And so there may have been something that had to do with that the author had in mind. But it certainly doesn't mean turn it into a free-for-all in love and war. Don't lose your ethical stance. Love and war are two very powerful energy vortexes.
They really are, aren't they? And so many times I've heard people say, you know, well, I know it wasn't right to do that, but I love her. And so, what else could I do? You know, and so love is sort of seen as an excuse to violate other people's boundaries on a regular basis, because after all, you know, I love you. And we see that even in families, where people feel a certain amount of permission to be just atrocious to each other in terms of, after having a bad day, come home and be, you know, nasty to each other and that sort of thing. And somehow, well, that's okay because our love, you know, you love me, and that's all right because you'll put up with it.
Or it's okay to do atrocities if we're at war.
Right.
And consider that the quote enemy is not human, they're not people.
Yeah, well, that's part of that is part of warfare. That sort of dehumanizing of the enemy.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. And that's difficult, I imagine. Once having dehumanized somebody, particularly a group of people, it must be very difficult to get back into focus. I would think probably the only way to do that is to form an individual relationship with somebody of that
And
group.
I think the people that do that tend to have an overwhelming love eventually for the ones they thought were the enemy. These people who are going back to Vietnam and helping people there. I think they have gone from that into an overwhelming love situation. So all of a sudden it's almost like two sides of the coin, love and hate. And when you turn that coin over, the love is just as powerful as the hate was.
Yeah, they do tend to go together. Let's take a look at our next belief system here. All religions teach the same basic moral truths. And he points out that when you talk about religious ethics, you must specify a particular religious tradition. In the book, he makes reference at that point to the situation you just mentioned, which is maybe some of the more extremist religious groups feeling like part of their mission would be to go ahead and kill other people. And he was saying, you know, so it really, depending on where you are in that spectrum, in fact, there are some differences. Is that your experience in your training?
There are some differences. Basically, we're back to the survival again, and how do we survive together? But then they start sorting out individuals' ideas of what these morals mean and what they are. For instance, perhaps somebody from a fundamentalist persuasion would feel it morally right to call someone a sinner. And from my persuasion, it's morally wrong to call someone a sinner. From my persuasion, that person has a lot of error thinking going on, and if they really knew who they are and the divinity that's within them, their behavior would change as a matter of course, as a matter of knowing. So to me it would be really harmful to tell somebody who was depressed and in a difficult situation that, well, you're there because you're a sinner. So there are some basic differences in how we apply that.
Well, and you know, that's true in terms of remembering that we each have our own screen we're looking through, so that we can have the same basic principles, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee we're all on the same page. There was an interview on National Public Radio last night, comes to mind, where Terry Gross was interviewing a gentleman who's just written a book on the history of religions in America, and was talking about, he used, for example, the Southern Baptist faith, and he mentioned several different famous Southern Baptists, and he says Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, Jesse Helms, there were a couple others, and he said, now, if you put those people up, even though they're of the same faith, there are very obvious differences between some of these
Yes,
men.
very
And
obvious
so,
differences.
so even within the same profession of faith, you're going to have that personality dynamic that goes into that, I think, that provides that screen.
Well, as religions grow and are interpreted over the centuries, they change and they become subject to some prominent people's ideas of what they should be. And once again, when I go back to the very root of these religions and the original idea of them, it bears no resemblance to some of what they talk about today.
That is so true, isn't it? Well, there's that, you know, I know in my own research, as I've read the different scriptures and their origin, I've read the Quran and different things, and it's interesting to read them and then look at the application in everyday faith and somehow see what has happened as people when we have somehow moved that to our own political or emotional agenda.
Christianity was never intended for the Crusades. Islam was never intended for terrorism.
Yeah, but somehow our filters allow a way to see it that way.
Yes.
Let's take a look at the next concern people have. Natural is morally better. And Joshua makes the statement that nature is morally neutral. We are not. Humans always act to change their nature, sometimes to their benefit, sometimes to their detriment. So this idea that somehow if I eat organic foods or I should never use medicine, that's the extreme, you know, in some of the Christian Science movement, you know, well, not to use medicines, but to have faith. That's sort of, when do we, you know, where does that come from? This idea that if it's natural, somehow it's superior, it's better.
Yes, and what is unnatural? Are not all of our medicines made of natural stuff at some point? And I guess I feel like I'm natural even though I've changed myself, and that perhaps I'm more natural than I was. You know, I don't know where the human being starts out as natural.
Okay.
You know, it's a very difficult thing to sort out. But, you know, is an infant natural in its infancy, and yet would infancy be appropriate for our adulthood?
Oh, let's hope not.
Let's hope not.
Though sometimes I have wondered with people. Let's take a look at our next question. This I thought was very interesting, this idea of loving humanity. That the devotion to humanity, he says, is often a mask for an inability to connect to other people on a personal level. Our emotions are directed to individuals and not abstractions. And that's why I had chosen that quote from Charles Schulz, which is, I love humanity, it's people I hate. This kind of vague vagueness that comes with kind of a global love.
Yeah, and I wish Charles Schulz had said, it's people's behaviors I hate.
Okay.
Because as I look around at people, I have seen people transform their lives from someone who was somebody I could hardly even stand to be around to someone I dearly loved. And that kind of tells me that that essence is within every person, and every person on this planet has the potential to change into some magnificently lovable being. And so in that essence, I love humanity. I love seeing the transformation. It happened to me, and it's what brought me into the ministry, and I've seen it happen in so many people's lives. And so no matter who I look at, even if it's Charles Manson, I know that there is a spark of divinity within him that should he become aware of that and choose to manifest it in his life, he would be the most loving, most wonderful being in the world.
What do you think, just in your experience, prevents people from making that choice? What kind of blocks do you think we have to sort of allowing that part of us to come out?
Oh, I think the greatest block is fear. Okay. And fear instilled in us when we're children, and perhaps so early that we don't even have a chance to articulate what our fear is, and so it's kind of a nameless thing. And so we're really afraid of who we are. We've been told that we're sinners, so we're really afraid we are monsters. And in that fear, we begin the self-hatred, and the self-hatred works itself out in harm to ourselves and each other.
Okay.
And it just spawns a myriad of blocks. You know, we've got a lot of names for all the blocks that people have, wonderful things, and codependency and all this wonderful stuff. But it all kind of describes the same thing. It comes from that same root of really being afraid that we are nothing, that we're terrible, that we're awful, that we're worthless.
And somehow we're damaged.
Yes.
And so the goal
yes.
is to not let anybody find that out.
That's right. Cover
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, that's a pretty common feeling. So in terms of loving humanity, I mean, the positive side of acting that out is in community service and participating at that level with the community. That ethically, as I've done some reading, you know, we talk about there's the internal ethic of values, but that somehow for it to be authentic, it needs to be translated into relationship, is my understanding, or into action.
Yeah.
So that even if I have the most fabulous love for humanity, or I have a strong belief in right and wrong, if I isolate and I am not connected with other people, somehow that kind of never goes anywhere, does it?
Well, and you might find that that person who is out there loving humanity is beating the kids at home.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Why is that? What do you think spiritually is going on with that? I mean, because that's so often true. You know,
Yep.
one of the things when I work with clients, they have often a strong history of religious upbringing,
And even
that sort of,
even human service.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And then, but in the home, it doesn't get acted out.
Comes back to the self-hatred and the child that reflects their own inner child and the fears that they had as a child and the self-hatred perhaps that they had against themselves as a child. They acted out upon their own children because these children are going to be mirroring themselves as children. And they're so unaware of this, and it gets triggered subconsciously before they even know what they're doing. They're into the violent act before they really know what they're doing and can catch themselves.
Mm.
And I remember I wasn't physically abusive, I was emotionally abusive to my children.
Mm.
And I would just be yelling my head off. And these were in the days when we didn't think that was emotional harm, we didn't
Right.
think that was abuse. And until I finally became conscious in this teaching that I'm in now of what I was doing. And suddenly I stopped myself mid-flight, my mouth wide open, and said to my kids, "You have never done anything wrong in your whole life. This is me I'm yelling at, and you've never done anything wrong." And I saw a change come across their faces that was beautiful, and I thought, oh, Carol, you got work to do. You really have work to do.
Well, on that note, we do need to close, but yeah, it does come down to personal work, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
That we need to translate our value systems out into action,
Yes.
and really be willing to own them.
Yes.
I want to thank you for tuning in. Join us next week as we address patient and therapist sexual contact. I'm Mary Crocker Cook. Good night.